In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how to trace your applications using the traceAXD utility. Now, if you're familiar with classic ASP, you probably used a lot of response.write statements to output the state of the application and whether it hit certain code and what the values of that code were. It was a very archaic way of kind of tracing what was happening internally with your ASP pages, because there was no good way to just step through the code and to find out what the values were, or to find out, get any feedback on how the pages were performing. That's all changed with ASP.NET. In fact, they give you some really neat little tools that allow you to see exactly what's happening in your page, and I've utilized these a couple times already, and they make life simple. They make life great. So what we've done is just modified an example from a previous lesson, and what I want to do was just show you how the application looks when it runs by itself without any tracing involved. So you can see our application came up in Internet Explorer after we've ran it. Nothing really outstanding. I'm going to type some values in here, and it displays found it. It does a little loop, just a little sample application. Okay, now what I want to do is select the form area. I'm going to close this. I'm going to select the form area so that I have highlighted the document. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time getting it to do what I want it to. There we go. And then I'm going to scroll all the way down till we get to the trace, which is by default set to false, but I'm going to select it and set it to true and save it. And then hit debug, start. And after just a moment, we'll notice that our page is radically changed. I still have my win form at the very top, but notice now as I scroll down near the bottom that there's a ton of information that is displayed for us about the state of our ASP page. And let's go through each one of these sections one by one. By simply turning on the trace flag, I have enabled myself to view a lot of information regarding the application. So it talks about, it has information rather about the session ID. Each time you create a new session, a GUID-like value is assigned to that session, and a session is basically a one visit by one person onto a web page, and each time that person comes back, they'll get a different session ID. Each time, no two people, the idea is, would have the exact same session ID. No two visits from the same person would have the same session ID. The type of request, it was a GET as opposed to a POST. What the status was, it was a 200, which means it was successful, as opposed to a 404 or other errors that we might encounter. The time of the request, the encoding. Now here's something interesting that we'll come back to in just a moment. The trace information. So by default, it's going to tell us the different stages. It initialized it, it pre-rendered the page, it saved the view state, and it began to render the page. And this is in fractions of a second how fast it took to do that. So many of these things happen immediately. Some of these things take a little bit more time, and you can kind of see where your bottlenecks are. Then you have a control tree. This is a breakdown of your application from the perspective of ASP.NET and containers. So for example, a page will contain a form, and the form contains a text box, 2 text box, 3 text box, and a button. It also has a cookie collection, which in this case, the only thing that was placed into the cookie was the actual session ID. The headers collection, and this is just typical things that you would see in an HTTP header. And then server variables. So this is all the HTTP values that were passed in. This is raw information that was passed in regarding the browser and things of that nature. And then just various values that we were able to hit in ASP Classic, but now this information is displayed for us very easily, and we can see the physical path. As you scroll down, we can see the query string, the remote address, the remote host rather, I'm sorry, the server name, just a ton of information regarding what it took to compile and place this page out. What was the request, the nature of the request. So a lot of great information. So suppose I do a post here, I put a 4 and a 6, and I hit the button. And so this will update our details. We can see more trace information was loaded. We can see the values that were actually posted in. Here's a form collection with the view state, which we talked about in a previous video. The values that were placed in text box 1 and text box 3. So it's just a great way for us to trace how our application is working. And all I had to do to get to that point was to simply set a value in the document. Again, if I can get there, to the document property window. Now what goes on behind the scenes is a little bit different. You can see that the trace is true, but what happened behind the scenes is that it placed an additional value of trace equals true within the directive for that web page. So since it's just a directive, a property in the directive, you can simply add this on your own. You don't have to use the visual interface that I use, the property box, to set that value. So if you're as excited as I was the first time you saw this, you're probably wondering to yourself, great, this is awesome. How can I add my own information into that trace page? And I'm going to show you how. Basically, all you need to do is use the trace context object to do that. The trace context object doesn't require that you do any implements or anything like that. You should be able to use it straight out with your pages by simply going like this, trace dot write, and then you have 3 interfaces that you can choose from. You can select a simple message. You can select a category, so you can say that this is a my category, and this is the message. And the third way is, and we won't demonstrate exactly how to use this one because it involves the category, which we'll call whatever, a message, but then also you'd have to pass in an exception object, and so it can display actually information about the exception. So we won't take time to show you that one right now, but we can do a simple one as we did here, or we can categorize it as so. So what I like to do is just change these messages to got here 1, and then just sprinkle these throughout my code. So for example, we've got here 2, and you can make this a little bit more meaningful than what I'm doing. Got here 3, and so on. And you can see the progression of your application. You can even print out values. For example, let's say that I want to here print out the value. So we're going to do trace dot write. The value is, and then we'll do just k dot toString. Whoops, toString. There we go. And so now we'll save this, and we will run it. And we'll look for our messages. Well, we can see here that our messages didn't show up, but ultimately it's because the code that we added it to was behind the button click event. So we're going to need to click our button. So put 4 and 6 in there and click our button, and our page reloads. And now look at all the wealth of information that we have. First of all, you see got here 1, and you see this is the message, but most importantly, it's categorized. And then got here 2, got here 3, and then we get a number of these. The value is for printouts from our case.toString value that was written out to the trace. Now, that would be great enough, but there's one other thing that I want to show you why this even goes beyond the greatness that you've just witnessed here. What I've done is create a new class library project called traceExample. It has one class called traceMe, and it has one function called calculateNumber that simply returns the value 3. So it doesn't do much. But the most significant thing about this example is that it allows you to pass in an object that is of type system.web.traceContext. Now, to make this work, I had to make a reference in the Solution Explorer to the system.web.traceContext object, or rather to the system.web.dll assembly. So I went here, I went to add reference, system.web.dll, I hit select, and then I hit OK. And that allowed me to reference the system.web.traceContext. And then I used the TC object to do a .write, and I pass in a category, and then I pass in a string. This is a message from a component that I wrote. So in other words, what this allows me to do is to pass in the traceContext object for my web page to this component that sits in an assembly, and it will then use that traceContext object to allow me to write out things from my object to the web page, the web page's trace functionality. So let's take a look then at how we reference this within our project. We'll go back to our solution. And you'll recognize this. What I did was I created a reference by going Add Reference to the new assembly, and I selected Browse, and I browsed to the appropriate directory. I won't go through that right now, but that was the first step. The second step then was to create an instance of the traceExample.traceMe class, and then I used that object reference to call the calculateNumber function, and I passed in the word trace, which is an object reference to the trace context for my web page. So I'm going to save this. I'm going to select Rebuild Solution. And I'm going to select Debug, Run. And in just a moment, our application will load again into the web browser. Now I'm going to select the value 4 and the value 7, and I'm going to select the button. And now let's scroll down and take a look at the trace information. And as I do, notice the first thing that comes up. The category is my component, and then the message is, this is a message from a component I wrote. And then it continues on into the other trace messages that we created earlier in this video. So this is very significant because I'm able to add tracing messages into the components that are consumed by my web application and have those messages integrated tightly into my trace messages, trace information. I think that's very great. Now you might say to yourself, this is excellent, but I don't want the tracing information shown every time that somebody hits my web page. In other words, I'd like to be able to see that trace information, but I don't want other people to be able to see that trace information. And for you, there's a simple solution to this problem. The first thing that I'm going to do is turn off the tracing for this page. So to do that, I'm actually going to go into the HTML and remove that trace statement at the very end of the directive. I do this instead of using the properties window because it will not allow me to select the option nothing. So I just want to get rid of it altogether. Instead, what I'm going to do is open up the web.config and make settings for tracing on the whole application. So to do that, I scroll down to the trace section, and I'm going to I'm going to actually change enable to true in the web.config. I'm going to leave the request limit to 10. That's how many requests should it store up in its cache, and this will make more sense in just a moment. Should it output to both the page and to the trace utility? No, just to the trace utility. That's what false means. Trace mode, sort by time, that's fine. We could also sort by category. And local only, we'll leave that as true. So this allows you to take a look on the box where this is being deployed and test it, but it does not give the ability for somebody coming from another box on the network or across the internet to access the trace utility. So I'm going to, with having made only changes to the enable property, I'm going to hit save. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the application. Notice that the tracing information is no longer found on the page. That's great. We type in our values, select the button, found it. Now there's no tracing information. Where did the tracing information go? Well, we've actually have a different place to look for that information, and that is in the trace.axt. Notice now that we went to a different page called trace.axt, a special page that contains information about the traces that we have. So there were two requests. There was a get, which got us the initial page, and then we posted values, and that's the post. So let's take a look at the post. We'll click View Details, and now we can see all the information, including the component information, category information, and so on and so forth for our web page. Everything we saw before, it's all compiled for us in this one spot. And we can go back and look up to 10 requests because we set the web.config to 10. We wouldn't want to change it to 100 or 200 because if we do that, then we're really not using memory very efficiently. We should only use enough just to test things, to debug them, but not as a log per se of events that have happened. It's not really intended for that. We can also click Clear the Current Trace, and it will remove from memory all of the traces that it has stored. You'll see here that it has remaining 10 traces left to go. So I really find this to be an extremely valuable tool. Both the trace context, being able to use it within our application to use custom trace messages, but then also being able to use that trace context from other components, being able to add tracing to any web page we build or to add it to an entire application, and using the trace utility. All of these things work together to give us a rich set of tools to actually find out how our application is actually performing. And so I hope that this was a beneficial video, that you learned a lot about tracing and debugging of your web pages. And thank you very much.